Hi, AJ.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I was
Are
waiting for
you
you
ready to?
to.
I'm
Yes,
sorry.
no, that's
Go
fine.
ahead. If you can go ahead and start the webinar, that would be wonderful.
Yeah,
We're
no,
ready to go.
excellent. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name's AJ Million, and I am a doctoral candidate at the.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
I'm a doctoral candidate in the School of Information Science and Learning Technologies at the University of Missouri, and today's webinar is titled Ethics in Library Research Data Services. My apologies for the technical difficulties with everything. We were actually in a different room and just transferred over to this one, so that's why we had trouble starting everything on time. So I'm going to start just very briefly with an overview of the purpose of today's webinar, kind of the background behind it, and then we'll go through three different presenters. They'll discuss some of the relationships between their presentations, and then we'll open it to everybody at the end. But the idea for this webinar came from a panel discussion in Boston at the annual ALISE conference run by the Ethics SIG. And this presentation, this panel discussion, focused on information ethics education and highlighted the need for a continuing connection between ethics and LIS education in ALISE programming. It's always something that's there, but it's not always made explicit, and everybody knows ethics education matters and it contributes directly to library and information science education, but we were talking about different ways to make this more explicit and draw more clear connections. And one idea that came out of it was this idea that data and ethics actually has a very broad impact in the scientific community right now, and that also connects to the services that libraries provide, specifically research data services, which are starting to be provided by especially university research libraries. So the great growth of data science and issues associated with the internet have contributed to a need for this, and today essentially what we're going to be doing is offering these three presentations to kind of establish some of the ways that ethics connects to providing research data services. Just before we begin, I'd like to make a quick thank you to John Burgess of the University of Alabama, Emily Knox of the University of Illinois, Kristin Parker, of course, at ALISE, Leanne Baller of the University of Pittsburgh. All four of these people helped to make this event possible. So with that said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just skip over the abstract that I was going to read of today's webinar and introduce our first presenter. Her name is Cheryl Thompson, and she will be presenting about ethical and legal challenges in research data services. So Cheryl is a doctoral candidate at the School of Information Science, or iSchool, at the University of Illinois-Champaign, Urbana, and her research focuses on how organizations develop data expertise and services to support e-science. She worked as a data manager and archivist in social research centers before pursuing her doctoral degree. So without further ado, I'd like to pass things on to Cheryl Thompson.
Thank you, AJ. Can everybody hear me and see my slides? Just let me know if you cannot. So my charge for this webinar today is to describe the ethical and legal challenges that librarians are facing in terms of research data services. I'm going to tell you about two data collections. One is alumni survey work with Dr. Cheryl Palmer that we've done as part of the Specialization in Data Curation program at the iSchool at Illinois. And the second pulls from data from my Research Data Alliance Fellowship looking at data services in academic libraries that I worked on with Michael Witt and Chuck Humphrey. So in 2013, the iSchool at Illinois had a large enough number of data curation graduates to conduct a survey where we could learn more about their work characteristics. We had 23 graduates respond to this survey, giving us an almost 40% response rate. We found the majority of our graduates were employed in using their data curation skills, and these positions were located in a variety of settings, such as academic libraries, national labs, and government agencies. Compliance was one of the top duties that was reported by our data curation graduates. Participants were asked to describe their work in an open-ended response question, and descriptions relevant to ethical and legal tasks were things like ensuring security, implementing access levels, complying with policies and mandates, and also developing local policies for research data. One graduate said their work included, quote, keeping data safe, end quote, and another reported, quote, defining levels of access given restrictions that have to be enforced for reasons of security or privacy, end quote. Security was also mentioned as a top challenge in terms of data curation work. For instance, one graduate described having to know what was the best environment for research data, like when you make a recommendation to deposit in a public repository versus maybe another type of repository. Finally, many of our graduates reported needing continuing education to keep abreast of the emerging practices and standards for research data. I also conducted a set of interviews with academic libraries, as I said, as part of my Research Data Alliance Fellowship that was funded by the National Science Foundation. I interviewed managers and librarians that were working in research data services in 22 academic libraries, and I had 26 participants. These libraries represented a range of institution types and locations. So in my interviews, I explored the data services that libraries were offering and asked them about challenges in providing these services. One of the top challenges reported was compliance. So many respondents described that the main motivation for library data services was actually to help their community comply with different regulations. Librarians are offering services and systems that must be compliant with a variety of mandates and requirements from funders, publishers, sometimes local policies on security and ethics, or government mandates coming from like the National Science Foundation or the Common Rule for Human Subjects Research. In addition to providing systems, they're also providing training and consultations on how researchers can comply with these mandates. One librarian described the struggle that she experiences in providing compliance consulting services across campus, where she just cannot be everyone's compliance officer. But she needs to know enough to provide resources and to make judgments if there's an issue potentially in a research design or with a data set. So some of the questions I heard were, what are the appropriate policies that they need to be complying with, and how can you also ensure that their services and systems are compliant for research data? So designing secure environments was another challenge that libraries are facing. Some academic libraries are providing a data repository for their communities, and these repositories and other tools need to be compliant with Information Security and Privacy Acts. A few standards mentioned were HIPAA and FERPA, as well as state government or university policies. One respondent described the challenges of providing HIPAA-compliant repositories, where the data must be stored on local machines and the library cannot utilize third parties that have services that comply with HIPAA and already understand how to comply with this legislation. So there were questions from librarians in terms of how to design and implement these secure environments for research data. Librarians also provide support on the appropriate license for research data and other products. Interviewees reported offering guidance to their communities on which license will meet the researcher's needs as well as comply with funder or other requirements. Several respondents expressed concern over offering these recommendations. They were asking questions, what was the right license for research data? Who owns research data? And this is a similar discussion that I've seen on data librarian listservs. Librarians were also providing access to special licensed research data. So several libraries offer faculty and staff access to large government or social science data sets that have special handling requirements. the library must ensure compliance with these licenses, which might mean data can only be available in secure campus systems or in a more dark archive setting. Questions around appropriate access levels and how to implement these were common questions that I heard in my interviews. Finally, how to handle data with sensitive information was a final service challenge. Participants mentioned researchers were wanting to deposit data that contained private or sensitive information into the library's data repository. And they had questions about whether they should be accepting data like this and whether their repository was really the right place to put this. And they also described challenges of who should be evaluating this data for having potential private and confidentiality concerns, and whose role is it to redact the data, to remove the sensitive information and ensure that participants' confidentiality is protected. I also asked the librarians about the knowledge and skill that was required to do a job like theirs. And looking at the responses, I saw many of the answers that I expected in terms of information organization, metadata, scholarly communication, but I also heard responses relevant to ethical issues. Several respondents reported the importance of understanding the regulatory environment that was relevant to research data and how to comply with these requirements. As I already said, this is a challenge for data librarians, and so often they need to partner with campus IT or research administration or the university council for expertise in information security or privacy, as well as how to implement different access levels for data that might contain sensitive information. Intellectual property and copyright law was another area of knowledge required for research data services. Although participants felt a new data librarian needed to understand how these laws applied to research data, many reported that they were seeking continuing education in this area or soliciting advice from their campus partners. So through these two data collections, we have a few lessons learned from our graduates as well as from our employers. The first item that we learned was that data librarians are encountering challenges in terms of data security in their positions and needing preparation for this type of work. Also stressed was the preparation for handling private information and complying with privacy acts and how to deal with these data sets that contain sensitive information. Copyright, intellectual property, licensing are also needed expertise in terms of research data services as reported by our libraries. And finally, compliance was a top duty of our graduates and a frequently mentioned challenge by data librarians. So compliance is a valuable service that libraries can offer their communities. So thank you for organizing this webinar and listening to me. I'm going to pass the baton to Kristin Briney, and I will take questions at the end. I think all the presenters are taking questions at the end.
Thanks for that presentation, Cheryl. Next, we have Kristin Briney. She is a data services librarian at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she advises researchers on data management plans and data best practices. Unique to the three presenters today, Kristin also has a PhD in chemistry and a master's degree in library and information studies, and she is the author of the book Data Management for Researchers and blogs about how to manage research data at
DataAbinitio.com.
At DataAbinitio.com. You did it much better than I could, so.
It's a chemistry term. No one gets it outside of chemistry, I think.
I had no clue, so take it away.
All right, thank you. So thank you for letting me be here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the practical aspects of delivering data services, but also within this ethical framework. And I want to start out by saying something that I kind of believe in, but others might not see it that way, and that is that I think that if you look at what libraries can traditionally offer and you extend that into data services, what we are best able to deliver in this area is not at all what researchers actually want. So I want to start out by talking about this library researcher disconnect that I perceive looking at the values and skills we can bring to data services. So the first example that I have of the 4 that I'm going to talk about is that we can help researchers find data. We're very good at finding information via newspapers or books or journal articles, and data is just one more type of information we can find for patrons. And actually, libraries have been finding census data and business data for people for a long time, and it shouldn't be that much more difficult to add research data or big data or all sorts of new data services, data sources to this repertoire. So the good news is that this first example of what libraries can bring to the table is something that researchers want. We're in alignment on this one. The next example is not as good of an alignment, and that is that libraries value openness because we want people to have access to information. And of course we provide access to our patrons, but ideally we'd like information to be as freely available as possible. Anyone outside of our libraries even should have access to information. So libraries are proponents of open access and open data. But if you're familiar with open access and open data, you know, open access doesn't always go over well with a lot of researchers, and open data can be even more contentious. So let me give you an example of this, and this comes from the New England Journal of Medicine earlier in this year, and they did an editorial on data sharing, and this is the infamous editorial that said, anyone who wants to use my research data is basically a research parasite. They got a lot of flack for this. This issue has popped up even more recently in the New England Journal of Medicine. They've had a set of editorials on data sharing, again with lots of different viewpoints. This issue is far from settled. So you can see that there is a little bit of a different opinion between the libraries, which value openness and access to information, and researchers who, many of them, are not on board with this idea of opening up their data. The third thing that libraries bring to the table is that infrastructure for actually finding and discovering data. And of course this goes along with open data, and that a lot of researchers aren't really interested in metadata and indexing and repository infrastructure for making their data available just because of the open data issue. But metadata is kind of one of those contentious things in data services. It's kind of the dreaded M word. It's not a word you should necessarily use with researchers because they don't understand it or they don't want it. And you know, when I was a chemist, I had a lab notebook and that was fine. I didn't need metadata. And personally, now that I'm a librarian, if I can get my researchers to not do stupid things with their lab notebooks, such as this example, which I absolutely love, you know, that's a win. I don't need them to go as far as metadata. That's not where they're at. Let's use what we have, such as lab notebooks, and do them better. The fourth thing that libraries bring to the table, in particular we can extend to data services, is preservation. And libraries have historically been very good at making sure that information stays around for long periods of time, and while that has traditionally been print materials, a lot of libraries are moving into digital preservation, and we can extend that fairly easily to data. But when you talk to people outside of libraries about preservation, a lot of times you get the, well, you're just talking about long-term storage, right? No, we're not. Long-term storage and preservation are two different things, but the priorities are different. So whereas a library might value that preservation, that's not necessarily where a researcher's needs are at. So I think there's a disconnect in this area too. So those are just 4 examples of what libraries bring to the table based upon our historic values and services that really don't align with where the researcher priorities are. So I want to talk a little bit about how to reframe this. So instead of talking about what researchers want, I think the obvious answer to this kind of statement I'm saying is that, you know, how do we deliver services that researchers actually need? But I think this idea of need is really important, and it goes beyond just this glib reframing that I'm doing. because I think that need is critically important for when we understand delivering data services to researchers. And I actually can't sum this up very well. I'm going to turn to one of my colleagues at IUPUI, Heather Coates, because she has this quote and really encapsulates what I'm talking about better than I can actually say. So she says, I learned in my first couple years that most of our faculty don't care about data management. It's an activity they have to do, but what they care about are their priorities, the things that interest them or are rewarded. I try to find out what those priorities are, funding for a new project, meeting promotion and tenure criteria, etc. I tend to start with the incentives and work backwards. And I think this is a really important thing to realize, is that faculty don't care about data management. They have their own priorities, things that take up a lot of time, and we have to go directly to what they need and build data management in data services into that, or we're never going to get anywhere with them. The other thing I think is important here when looking at need is, because a lot of data services are so new, we're basically persuading researchers to do something that we want them to do that they haven't done before. And let me steal another slide here from Dorothea Salo, who's an instructor at UW-Madison at their information school. She gives a lecture on persuasion and talks about why people do what you want. And I want to go through this list because I think it's really helpful, and think about it in terms of data services. So of the 5 things that she says why people do what you want, the first is because you have power over them. And that might work for Dorothea in her class, but me in the library, that's not going to fly with a researcher outside the library. Number 2, because you're offering a return that they want. That's something I can work with. Number 3, because they think you're nifty. And if you've got that as a librarian, if you've got good relationships and people like you, you should totally trade in that. But you can't always rely on that as a basis for persuading people to do what you want. Number 4, because they think what you want is nifty. Let me just say open data and leave it at that, that maybe that's not always going to work. And number 5, because there's nothing and no one preventing them from doing what you want. And again, I think this isn't going to work very well because of the way the reward system in research works. It's not necessarily aligned with what we're trying to persuade researchers to do. So if you look at this list, really, I mean, you can have people who think librarians are nifty, that's great, but the only one you can really rely on is us offering a return that they want. So we have to offer something that researchers want, researchers need, and that's the only way we're going to be able to sell researchers on our data services and get them to be thinking about data in new and different ways and kind of push them. The last thing that thinking about researchers in terms of need is that we can put ourselves in their shoes in this framework, and that allows us to bring empathy to the table. And sometimes I hear around data services, and I certainly have done it myself and I'm guilty, things like, well, why did the researcher do it that way? That's just stupid. Come on, can't you do better by your data? That kind of sentiment. And the thing is that who is teaching our researchers to do it better? The answer is likely no one in many, many cases. I certainly didn't get trained how to manage my data as a researcher, and I think putting ourselves in researchers' shoes and thinking about what they need and understand where they're at can help bring an empathy to the way that we start delivering data services and really make better connections and really help them in a fundamentally different way than just saying, oh, we're good at this, here we can help you. So let me give you actually a couple examples of what I'm talking about before I go any further. And let's go back to the idea of open. So oftentimes when you hear people talking about open data, for example, they say, well, it's the right thing to do, it's more transparent for research, it isn't going to enable us to catch errors faster or catch fraud, and it's just the right thing to do, which is kind of true, but also doesn't really convince people who are kind of against it to start making their information openly available. A better argument, maybe not as strong, is to say, you know, if you make your data openly available, you actually, it's been shown that you can actually get more citations for your papers. And this is something that directly stems from what you need. You need higher citation counts, and open is a way to get you there. So it's a different framing of the way we're pitching our data services. A second example is about data management, and sometimes I hear people say, oh, you have to do data management because your funder says so and you have to do a data management plan. And a lot of times what happens is a researcher will write the plan and totally forget about data management because it's not actually required. So this argument that you have to do data management because you're told doesn't really go very far. Better to say that data management can actually save you time and effort and resources. So we've all been in a place where we're trying to find a particular file and maybe we spend 20-30 minutes tracking it down. When you finally find it, you're trying to figure out what the heck you did in this file, or maybe was it this file or this file, and pretty soon you're digging through your notes and you throw your hands up in exasperation and say, enough, I'm just going to collect the data all over again. This happens surprisingly often in research. This was actually a year of my life when I was a researcher trying to understand somebody else's data. So I think if we can say, rather, if your data is well managed, that saves you that effort. You should be able to find your data and understand it very quickly, even if that data is from several years ago. So I think this is a better argument, a better way to put ourselves in researchers' shoes and convince them data management is something that's actually going to help you rather than something you have to do. And I think this framing based on need is much more persuasive. So I want to end my little portion of the webinar by talking about what researchers want and what researchers need and how we can frame our data services within this framework. So if you have an average researcher at an academic institution, what do they want? They want to do good research, they want to get grants, they want to publish well, they want to get tenure, and there's probably some other things that they want as well, depending on the local institution. So let's break all 5 of those down and talk about what libraries can and already are doing in these different areas. And the point is not necessarily to introduce you to new services, but to understand that this framing is really central to how we can think about data services. So let's dive in and talk about doing good research. And this goes back to the argument I just made for good data management. And libraries across the country, around the world, are teaching researchers better data management skills. And here I've got a screenshot of the New England Collaborative Data Management Curriculum, NECDEMIC. And this is just one of many curricula that we're teaching researchers how to improve their data management. I said, Heather Coates, my colleague, said earlier, researchers don't care. We can teach them to do it better. Another thing that researchers care about is grants, and anymore, many of them, at least in the United States, are under this memorandum from the Office of Science and Technology Policy saying you have to do a data management plan and share your data if you want grants from federal funding agencies. And I've heard plenty of stories of grants that have actually been rejected due to poor data management plans. So, who can help you with that? Your library. Librarians can come in and say, let's make your data management plan better so you can get that grant. Another thing that libraries can help you with is publications, because anymore a lot of journals are saying if you want to publish in our pages, you have to make your data available. And libraries are very good at assessing information sources, and it might have been which journal to publish in before, but now it's which repository should you put your data in. And we can help researchers navigate this new information landscape. And even better, actually, we might have infrastructure in-house to help you put your data somewhere. We might have a repository, an institutional repository, a data repository that you can share your data and help you comply with these new policies. And on top of that, of course, now we actually start sneaking in what we want in preservation. So we build an institutional repository, a data repository, and all of that stuff we can do digital preservation on, take care of it well. So I want to say in this framing, we're starting with what researchers want first, but we're not ignoring what we as librarians want and what we think is best for the information. It's just secondary. It just comes along for the ride. It comes after we kind of get to researchers and what they want. So we shouldn't ignore what we want, but it's never the first thing we lead with in this area. The fourth thing that researchers want, and this is particular for faculty, of course, is to get tenure. And this is where it gets a little harder because I think the playing field is a little skewed, okay, pretty skewed against data at the moment. But anymore, we're starting to think of data as a research output. So one thing that we can do is advocate for people to say data is an important research project. You can put it in your tenure packet. Or my library colleagues who are on the tenure track can put data in their research their dossiers and model away. I think there's definitely room here for us to advocate for better practices, to illuminate people that data can be part of tenure, and to show you that maybe things don't always line up against where we want to interject data in terms of researcher need, and then in those cases we need to kind of step out and push the boundaries a little bit. The last thing in terms of researcher needs is there's lots of other needs depending on local institutions, and I'm going to pull from yet one more colleague of mine who is Jameen Brooks-Kiefer from Kansas, and at the Midwest Data Librarian Symposium last fall, she introduced this idea that data services are a garden, and I love this analogy because she basically said that not everything grows in every garden, and not every service offering will thrive at every institution. So Jameen at Kansas and me at UW-Milwaukee, we're going to have different gardens just because of our local environments, and we're going to offer different services. So it's very important for us as people who are delivering data services to understand what the local need is and build things that are going to thrive in that environment. So there are lots of things we can do here, lots of tools we can use to understand what needs are. For example, produce digital curation profile toolkit, or just simple interviews with faculty and researchers and graduate students and research support people to understand what else do researchers need. It might be data visualization, it might be just general storage, and how we can build services around those particular needs, but always rooting everything in terms of need. So to wrap it up, I think this framing of data services is really, 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 really important. It seems obvious, but it really matters. I think it's the only way that we're going to sell these services because we actually have to sell something that people want. There's no other way to get people to do what we want in this area because it's new without giving them what they want and what they need. But the good news is that if you think about things in terms of researcher needs, there's lots of opportunities for libraries to work within this value system, several of which I showed, and that doesn't mean giving up on what we value, it just means that that takes a back seat and it kind of rides along with what researchers value and be like, oh, by the way, if you're doing this, you should really do this because it's best practice. Finally, don't forget empathy, as many researchers were never taught good practices. If we put ourselves in researchers' shoes, it'll really let us communicate better with them, understand them better, and really deliver better services. So with that, I want to thank you very much for listening to me. And let's see if I can get this presenter switched over to Michael Zimmer, who is next.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Kristin. Our next presenter is Michael Zimmer, who's presenting about conceptual gaps and policy vacuums. Michael is a PhD, or is a privacy and internet ethics scholar, most notable for his work in online privacy, the ethical dimensions of internet technologies, library privacy, and internet research ethics. He's an associate professor in the School of Information Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where he also serves as the director for the Center for Information Policy Research. So with that said, take it away, Michael.
Thank you, AJ, and hopefully I successfully made my screen visible. And I'm really pleased to be a part of this webinar and listening to Cheryl and Kristin's contributions. We really have a really nice collection of perspectives and approaches to this common problem of how do we deal with new ethical dimensions in data services and sort of big data in general, especially in terms of how libraries are going to play a role in this. I was asked to present more of a theoretical approach and contribution to this, which is why I'm going to talk about these issues of conceptual gaps and policy vacuums. And I'm going to approach this from the perspective of computer ethics and information ethics and internet research ethics, which are some of the areas that drive my work. And thinking back to some of the origins of computer ethics, Jim Moore talked about this in terms of the fact that new technologies that are emerging leave us with policy and conceptual vacuums on how to use these technologies and also how to deal with them in an ethical, policy, legal, regulatory kind of frameworks that our existing policies or existing approaches to dealing with problems related to new technologies somehow now feel inadequate. They aren't able to sort of meet the needs of this new information environment. And I've used this framework a lot in thinking through what does it mean for us to now be offering data services, to be doing big data-based research, to be doing data science in a broad sense. And how do we have conceptual gaps? How do we have policy vacuums as we're trying to train our students, as we're trying to train researchers, as we're trying to train data librarians? These are things that we're going to have to deal with. We're going to have to try to recognize these conceptual gaps. We're going to have to try to recognize these kind of policy vacuums that are emerging. And I'm going to break this down into two different ways. First, as ethicists, and this is largely the community that I belong to and that I engage with, we have all kinds of new conceptual gaps in how we think about ethics when it comes to research that's using large data sets. We've had decades of research ethics dealing with a variety of different kinds of environments, but now we have new conceptual gaps in how we think about privacy, how we think about informed consent, how we think about potential harm to research subjects. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and then more importantly, as practitioners, as data librarians or whatever your function might be, we have new policy vacuums. A lot of this is what Cheryl's survey was reviewing, that we have all kinds of new questions opening up on how do we help researchers obtain data, store data, and share data. So I want to look at these. I'm going to look at these through the lens of a couple of different kinds of data-rich studies that I've assessed and that I've been involved in critiquing or analyzing or studying. And each of these is a little bit unique. Each of these has its own history and its own outcomes. Some of these involve libraries and data librarians, some of them don't. But they sort of set a story for us in terms of helping us think through these new conceptual gaps that emerge in these policy vacuums that we have to deal with. The first one you may have heard about, it's been 10 years already, or AOL. If you remember AOL, it used to be a powerful search engine, and over many years, AOL released search data to the academic community. There are a lot of scholars, colleagues here at UWM who study search engine logs to understand information-seeking behaviors. AOL gave that data to the community. It just so happened in 2006, it was a little bit more visible that they were giving this data out, and they did a poor job at anonymizing the data. They tried to anonymize it, they just did a bad job, and you were able to re-identify people. Famously, the New York Times tracked down the woman just by looking at the anonymized searches in the data set, and she was shocked that this data was out there. Consequently, AOL stopped releasing this data, and it becomes a problem now for researchers that are trying to get access to this kind of data when we have this kind of challenge. So we'll come back to this. It's an interesting case. Another case happened at Harvard. A set of researchers wanted to study social interactions, wanted to study different ways that closed networks interact both online and offline. And they decided to do this by tracking the social and physical interactions of an entire freshman class at a university and track that class over 4 different years. And so what they did is they went in and they scraped the data. They had the university cooperated with them, gave them a list of all the students, started scraping all their data, and did that every 4 years as this cohort went through their college career. This was an NSF-funded research project, and as you heard, it's increasingly required that you release your data. So they started to release their data in September 2008 with the promise that all this data has been cleaned so you can't connect anyone to an identity. Now, I'm a privacy scholar, and whenever I hear something like that, my ears start to ring a little bit. And I actually investigated a little bit, and this anonymous data set was actually pretty easy to re-identify, and I identified it as actually coming from Harvard University. I did that without actually ever looking at the data. It was just by looking at the code book and some of the messages that the researchers put out. So I put a paper out about this. It created a little bit of a stir, and these researchers had to pull the data set because the confidentiality and privacy of the subjects wasn't as strong as what they had hoped it would be. Most people here probably realize that the Library of Congress struck a deal with Twitter 6 years ago to start archiving all public tweets. So every single tweet that existed up until that point and every tweet after that point is being sent to the Library of Congress for them to archive and presumably make available to researchers. This is a really big project. It introduces all kinds of interesting ethical challenges. You know, can I opt out of having my tweets archived by the Library of Congress? Many users may not recognize that tweets are even archived at all at Twitter. Many users might think it's okay for my tweet to show up on Twitter, but I never thought that the Library of Congress would have it for all of eternity. All kinds of interesting challenges that emerge when this kind of a relationship is struck and this kind of new data archiving process. And it's important to note that it's been 6 years and the Library of Congress still hasn't figured out how to do this. It's a big problem from a technological standpoint. It's also a big problem from an ethical and policy standpoint. The last one is a much more recent case. It just happened a few months ago where a graduate student researcher in Denmark decided to do a study looking at OkCupid profiles, and he realized he could create an account, go on to OkCupid, and start grabbing data. So he did that, and then he shared that data of about 70,000 users and didn't change anything. It had all the usernames, it had an email address if that was in there, it had what kind of sex you're interested in, it had all the answers to these profiling questions that you answer on OkCupid. And his argument for putting it out there was that the data was already public. Because it was on OkCupid, and if you create an OkCupid account, you would see that data. So what's the harm in just organizing it and making it available in a more useful format for researchers? And we see this kind of logic showing up quite often, that this data is already out there and I'm just sort of providing it in a better sense. A lot of criticism took place here, and he had to, well, he didn't pull the data. One of the data repositories that was hosting the data removed the data, but he still actually makes it available if you contact him. So each of these cases have in common that researchers were trying to use data in very unique ways. They were using social data or public data or some kind of large data sets in order to study some unique phenomenon. It was very unique type solutions and processes. They were trying to do good things. They weren't trying to mess with people or out people or hack people, all in good interest. But they create a lot of really interesting and novel conceptual gaps in how we think about this as ethicists. And I've talked about this a lot in other contexts. I'm not going to go through all these slides. I've put these on my website, and you'll see them up on my Twitter feed. But we have this new gap about what is private information. And most of the research ethics regulations, or if you talk to a policy person, they talk about it that only information that is restricted has to be protected. Only information that has personally identifiable information has to be protected, and things that might just be sitting on a website or sitting on a Twitter feed are automatically public. And we're starting to see some questioning of that existing logic. We have this new conceptual gap about what does it mean to have private information. There is no longer this strict dichotomy between public versus private. We need to think much more contextually. We need to think about what are users' understandings of the architecture. There's all kinds of interesting questions about, I posted something on Facebook 5 years ago when I was able to restrict the visibility of that piece of data. Now Facebook has changed their architecture where that piece of data is automatically visible to everyone. Does that mean it's now fair game? So all kinds of interesting nuances come up when we start dealing with these kind of complicated data sets from these very complicated sources. And as ethicists and data librarians, we need to recognize that these kinds of challenges are there. The same issue emerges with consent. We used to presume that information that was out there in the public, you didn't need to get consent in order to access it and do research with it. I oftentimes hear the argument that how is scraping Facebook any different than sitting in a public park and just observing people as they walk by? And there's a lot of differences there, and then we need to rethink how we frame consent. Again, just because a person puts information onto a dating website doesn't mean that they're necessarily consenting for that information to be used in some other way by a researcher or by someone in a different kind of context or a different kind of setting. So we do need to rethink what we mean by consent when we start thinking about this kind of data-rich research environments. And then this relates to the question of harm. A big part of research ethics, of course, is trying to protect subjects from unreasonable harm. And harm typically is measured as some kind of physical or tangible impact. And we're slowly starting to see more of a shift towards reputational harm, a conception of harm that approaches it more from an idea that we need to respect someone's personal dignity, that someone needs to be able to have control over their data. And harm is just not that if you got hacked or if there's identity theft or something more physical happening to you. So these are all different kinds of conceptual gaps that researchers that deal with data have to deal with, that IRBs or ethical review boards are dealing with, and we've been spending the last few years sort of grappling with all these kinds of issues. And we don't have answers yet, but we are starting to rethink the way that we approach some of these problems from an ethical standpoint. But we need to turn our direction now towards the pragmatics of being a data librarian. And we're starting to see, of course, a much larger focus on the role of librarians in helping researchers get this data. This is what Kristin was talking about. How do we help people access data? How do we help them store data? How do we help them share data? And that's introducing all kinds of new challenges as practitioners. And that's when we point to the existence of policy vacuums. I think there's been long-standing policies in place, and I'm sure others here will be able to talk about this, in more detail than I could, and how data might be shared or stored or archived within an institutional repository. But given these conceptual gaps that we're recognizing from an ethical standpoint, are our existing policies working, or are there vacuums out there, and how do we deal with this? So one of them has to do with obtaining data. You might be asked as a data librarian to help someone find a data set that's already out there. As more and more data is being shared, you might have to help them find one of those shared data sets. Or even helping a researcher scrape data themselves, helping them with a tool that you can use online to get data from a Twitter feed or for a comment stream on a blog site. But now we need to think about the provenance of those data sets. How is that data collected? There are data sets out there that were hacked data. There's a data set from the Ashley Madison dating site that was a hacked data. Should you help someone find and use that data as a data librarian, or is the fact that that data was hacked somehow make that data tarnished and that we shouldn't be helping users access that data? So we need to rethink, there's going to be some interesting dilemmas for us on how we help users and researchers obtain data sets. We have some new challenges and some policy vacuums on how we store data. You might be in charge of an institutional data repository. You also might be helping researchers craft data management plans, which more and more funding bodies require. So we have all kinds of new challenges now. Should data be de-identified before you store it? How do you make sure that a researcher has done a sufficient job of de-identifying data before you store it in your repository? What kind of security do you need to have in place? Is it just access controls? Is there some kind of a strong encryption you have to have in place? Should there be any data, any plan in place in order to remove data from the data set or destroy data or certain elements of a data set or an entire data set? All kinds of new challenges that we're going to have to face when we start dealing with these large data sets, especially from social media kind of platforms. And the last one is, how do we share data? How do I make my data available? And we have new challenges and new policy vacuums here as well. What kind of access restrictions should be in place? What's a reasonable limitation? Does someone have to be doing authorized research, or can anyone access the data? Should you only make data available in a de-identified form? There's been research done on whether or not I should data is aligned with the assumptions under which the data was first gathered. So I may have made my social stream available to a researcher because they were studying a certain thing, but that doesn't mean that I want some other researcher studying something different to be able to access that same data. We need to think through some of these challenges. It's going to be interesting to see how we work through these different policy vacuums. I think that's one of our big jobs here today, is to help frame our approach. I think many of us that are teaching in iSchools or library programs, we can start reframing how we're teaching future practitioners to think about these issues. I think what Kristin was mentioning is really important on how we have to also start training researchers to be thinking more about this. I spend a lot of time talking with researchers and IRBs about these issues. I think this might be a really important role for data librarians to help contribute to that conversation as well. I have a couple of resources. Again, this is online. There's a lot more we can talk about here, but I want to just provide that kind of sort of conceptual framework and about how we're dealing through these kinds of issues within the realm of information ethics and policy. And I look forward to any questions that we'll have later in this presentation. So I need to see how I hand this back to AJ.
You have.
I have.
Yes. No, well, thank you so much, Michael. That was great. What we're going to do now is, I'd say just for the next maybe 5 or 10 minutes, is just open things up for the panelists, so Kristin, Cheryl, and you, Michael, to maybe make some connections and discuss maybe some of the areas of overlap between each of your different presentations. We can take 5 minutes, or if there's no need to continue on too much longer, then we can just open up to questions. And then after that, we'll just open it up to questions from the audience. Does that sound good? All right. All right, so it seems you all have your microphones on, so you should be set to go. So I guess one connection that I saw kind of running through everything was, Cheryl, you started out kind of talking about the workplace and, you know, the survey that you sent out and some of the follow-up interviews kind of identifying this new need for librarians, you know, or opportunity to provide these services, especially research data services, to library patrons. And then Kristin, you talked about reframing it. And then Michael, you talked about some of the policy gaps and pieces in between. I guess the question I have is, how does everything, was there anything that stood out among all three of you that kind of connected the 3 different areas of your presentations?
Well, this is Kristin. One thing I was really struck with what Michael was talking about is the policy gaps and those questions that kind of pop up in delivering services that don't necessarily have clear answers or clear policy. And totally unrelated to anything I've done a research project with colleagues Abigail Gobin and Lisa Zielinski to look at institutional data policy. And one thing that I was struck with is what we found in institutional data policy in the United States, and just under half of all Research 1 and Research 2 universities have some policy that covers data, and sometimes that's the IP policy, but they don't really get at those ethical issues. A lot of times it says, we, the university, own your data, and you are the data steward, and here's how long you have to retain it, and here's what happens when you leave the university. And that's really what we found that policy consisted of, but it doesn't necessarily help me as a data services librarian answer those persnickety questions that pop up all the time on how to actually properly handle data in an ethical way. So I was really struck by those policy gaps and what I know a little bit about institutional data policy.
Yeah, and it's one of the real interesting challenges is that there's never going to be that simple answer. It's like, you know, whenever I have students in the classroom, they just want the yes or no. Like, you know, what do I tell a patron? You know, and it's like, well, it depends. You know, or when I talk with IRBs, it's like, you know, all we can do, and maybe that's the benefit of my position, is just being someone that talks about ethics, is sort of shaping the debate and you know, illuminating the issues and the questions that need to be addressed. And your point on the data policy, I mean, I know even on our campus, it's an interesting challenge that I've experienced when working even with faculty members on crafting good data policies. And related to this, and we didn't talk much about data security today, but that's a related issue here. And I recall on our campus a few years ago, we tried to create a data security policy for research data in case you have data that has genetic information or social security numbers or other kinds of data that you want to, that particularly needs to be secured. but the faculty research committees didn't want to pursue that because it's yet another hurdle that they have to go through in order to get a proposal funded or get something published. And that's one of the big challenges that I think we have as well, is helping researchers understand that these aren't hurdles. These are just things that in order to be a good researcher, in order to be in good practice and be able to make the most benefit of your data, these are all things that we need to be thinking about.
Yes, exactly. I'm hoping that that policy, actually, they're working on it again. I'm hoping it goes a little bit better this time. But yeah, it's just a lot of times people see this as, oh, you want me to do what? I have to jump through this other hoop. It's like, no, actually, it helps you.
Right,
just
right.
Let me convince you.
Well, and the other thing that I've seen in practice, and I've also experienced in terms of what my work experiences, is when policies conflict. So especially with my history in the social sciences, funders and publishers want you to make your data available that's underlying your article, but it's qualitative data, and there's, maybe it would take a lot of work to actually redact your data set, and then how useful is it afterwards? After I've removed all this personally identifying information, can you still use the data for anything useful? I think that's another challenge that's also coming up that I think we need guidance on.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So a quick question I have for everybody, just to kind of keep this going, just based off everything you've said, what do you think some of the most obvious implications are for LIS education and LIS curricula? I see bits and pieces, but it seems like there's almost like a management aspect in some regards, because the ethics piece definitely ties into it. It's an underlying concern that never goes away. But it seems like so many of these issues are context-based depending on the type of data and the type of institution you're working at and policies and needs. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I definitely subscribe to, well, you say eat your own dog food, but it's better to say drink your own champagne. One of the things I bring to my job is the fact that I was a researcher and did terrible things to my own data. And I think in terms of educating people around data services, it really helps to get in there and see what it's like to do research and manage, even if it's a small project, to manage your own data. I have my colleague Abigail Gobin did this with even just the death statistics, and went through the process of managing that data set and understood the ins and outs and things that can pop up. So I really think that having that experience can really understand, putting yourself in researcher's shoes, as I said earlier, it's kind of an important thing to bring to this area because you really understand the ins and outs just that much better.
And I agree with Kristin. Having that experience can really teach you a lot, especially in terms of the classes that we offer here at the iSchool. I know the data curation class, like if you can actually get the students to work with the data set, they can really understand better. But one of the challenges we actually have is finding data sets that the students can use that have some of these challenges and these issues embedded in them. And so from a teaching standpoint, especially when you have, 25, 30 students every semester, trying to find them that experience can be challenging.
Yeah, that actually points to an interesting, need for cases and for like a test environment or some kind of how do we create a module where here's data and that they can play around with safely, and it's not real data that could put anyone at harm, and thinking through that. And I'm now just brainstorming different ways of making that happen, but that would be really interesting. I think the other piece that I think we as educators can help with is, I guess it follows what both Kristin and Cheryl were saying in terms of helping build the digital literacy of our students, that they're going to be now exposed to. Oh, it's not just like the old data archiving needs of 20 years ago. It's all different kinds of stuff that's out there. And it's like whenever our library students complain that we require a research methods class, it's like, well, you need to know how this is going on in the field. You need to know how this is happening so you can provide better services. And I think we're going to have to include more research ethics and more digital ethics and some of those kinds of dimensions into these kinds of into our curriculum to help prepare data librarians to at least have the right vocabulary to engage in these kinds of debates.
So kind of connecting to that, would that look more like having like an embedded practicum for students or something in a course, like in maybe in a lab, as opposed to, you know, working just in a library like a traditional practicum would, or something like that?
Yeah, yeah.
That's something we've done here at Illinois. We've tried to provide internships for our students in like national labs. Also, some were placed at the Smithsonian. And I think that's a great and valuable experience for the students. It's just a management standpoint in trying to create beneficial opportunities and educational opportunities like that.
The other thing that's beneficial, because when I was in library school, I was actually a research assistant in a lab, but then on top of that, I had a semester-long experience actually providing digital curation projects. So we actually had clients, and we had to use what we were learning in the semester and apply that to our clients and help them with their data management issues. And I think experiences like that, where you can connect library school students with people with real data management needs and trying to have something deliverable in a semester, is really helpful.
I think another way to approach this, you know, and I don't know, this might play out differently in different universities with different kinds of contexts, but from what I see, researchers are engaged in a project. Now I have my data. Now let me go, you know, to the library. Now help me, you know, store and share this data. And it's the end of the process versus having a data librarian. You know, this would be great if there were like 50 of them on every campus to sit in on the project, and you're part of the project team from the start. You know, and so as the data gathering's happening, or as, you know, the project gets developed, the librarian is introducing, you know, their needs and their issues from the start, and it becomes much more of a collaborative effort as opposed to at the end of the process kind of effort. That might be a new way for us to think through that, or that might be a good way, you know, like you were saying, AJ, to get students, you know, involved. They go sit on a project team or sit in on research meetings to sort of observe from that kind of way.
I very much agree with that mentality. I think one of the things I like to say is that, you know, if we want to collect data that's nice and pristine and well documented for us to redistribute in our data repositories, we have to get into that process early so the data is well managed from the beginning, because otherwise it's just going to be a nightmare to get everything in a form for other people to reuse.
All right, I've got a couple of questions that have come in if you are ready to start fielding them, and if anybody else wants to ask them, just type them in the question box and they'll pop up and I can read them off. This first one says, I'm curious about your initial thoughts about how whistleblower data should be handled, particularly data that could be considered either intellectual property or classified information. So just kind of in the context of this discussion, not only as researchers, but also like kind of putting on our librarian hats, what would our thoughts be about that? How would that even be handled?
So from an ethical point of view, I've talked a little bit about this in the past, like related to WikiLeaks data. Like should a library archive WikiLeaks data? And I guess as an ethicist, you could try to engage in a thought process on whether or not is there a large public benefit that could come by having access to this data versus the harm that's caused because it was leaked from somewhere. And so, you know, that's going to be an easier calculus to make with some kind of data versus other kind of data on whether or not there's a broader public good. We've had the same issue with that AOL data set. There wasn't anything illegal about it. They just pulled it from circulation due to the thoughts. But if I already have the data, can't I still use it? And I'm kind of torn on that, so I don't think I quite have an answer yet for that from an ethical perspective. But maybe Kristin or Cheryl know more from more of a practitioner perspective.
I think that's one of those cases where there's no clear yes or no answer.
Yeah.
I agree, and I would probably try to think about whether there's an embargoing the data for a certain time period might help protect whether it's national security or individuals. But I think it's one of the messy areas that we have in this field of data management and data curation. There's a lot of messy areas that there's not an exact answer for yet.
And it's going to happen more because, like the OkCupid case was a graduate student, coming up with an idea. When we're dealing with these kind of data sets today, it's not some tenured professor who has a $5 million grant and all kinds of ethical grounding and support. It's our students, writing a Perl script, and all of a sudden they've got a terabyte of data, scraped from somewhere. So we're going to get these kind of messy scenarios more often.
So I've got not a question, but a thought. This person says it sounds like there needs to be 2 studies, or maybe there's a need for studies or some research. So one would be research data handling and sense making by data librarians and IRBs in order to identify some of the questions and decisions to continue identifying decision points and quandaries. So I guess one would be focus on data handling and sense making by librarians, and then the other one would be maybe something related to IRBs. So maybe one of the questions about this is, as far as kind of some of the decision points and quandaries and high level maybe best practices, are there any resources out there or documents that provide maybe stuff in a question and answer format or in some way that kind of looks at these sort of decision points and issues that people need to consider?
From a researcher perspective, there's a growing set of guidelines to help guide your research ethics, especially dealing with data and internet-based research. So the Association of Internet Researchers have an ethics guideline. They have a second version of that that's quite helpful. The American Psychological Association has a guideline. And so that kind of data is increasingly out there. What we're not seeing, and I'm actually starting to craft a couple of research projects similar to what that person was describing, is looking at how our campus is approaching this. Now that there's these data mandates by the NIH or the NSF, how are researchers crafting their data sharing plans, and how is it actually being implemented? What I hadn't thought of, which is what I really like about this question, is also then bringing in the data librarian and how are they integrating into all this. So I think from that side there's a greater need for some better best practices to emerge.
Yeah, I think there's the problem is there's a bunch of a wide spectrum of data here that we're talking about, and there are issues when you have sensitive data that needs to be redacted or not shared at all, but there's a lot of data that can just be shared, and then you run into things that, for example, IP issues and copyright and research data is just, if you think copyright's great, talk about copyright and research data, it just gets really murky. So there's a couple things I've found out that are really helpful. SURF from the Netherlands has a really nice legal status of raw data guidelines that kind of walk you through, well, if your data are like this, it's probably under copyright, it's not. But it's really hard, I think, to have any particular resource to point to because everything is changing and things are developing fairly quickly in this field, which is part of the reason I like to work in this field, but it also makes it kind of challenging. So I think one of the things that we could stand to have in this field still is better, more definitive resources in a lot of these different areas.
So, for the audience, are there any other questions that you would like to ask? Feel free to go ahead. And if not, as far as the panelists, if there's anything else you would like to bring up or to conclude, that would be great. We have about 8 minutes left in our time for the webinar, so that'd be a good time to kind of start wrapping everything together. And if there are no questions, then we can go ahead and end a little bit early. I know an hour and a half is a long time for a webinar. All right, I've got one last question. Oh, and this is a really, really good one. Okay, so one of the audience members asks, how do we deal with cross-border data? So that means data sets that deal with different legal jurisdictions, I'm assuming.
I wish there was an easy answer for that.
Yeah, a lot of those run into different, for example, copyright restrictions. And the good news is things like Creative Commons, a lot of those licenses were built to try to be as international as possible. So there are some things in place, such as the Creative Commons licensing, to get across those issues, but it really depends. And this is an area where oftentimes I say, you better actually go talk to a lawyer because they might know better than I would.
So just a thought that I have, and of course this isn't my area of expertise, but I know basically kind of issues related to globalization are always difficult from any legal perspective. And it seems like there'd be a lot that has to do with reciprocal arrangements among countries, and then that creates all these different conflicts. Because I know with information, copyright laws especially, the U.S. and China have had issues in the past enforcing copyright laws and things along those lines. So it kind of seems like this is tied up into the mess that is dealing with fragmented rules and all these different boundaries when in some ways the internet doesn't really adhere to those.
Yeah, and I think you don't even have to look across international borders to find issues, because if I have a collaborator who's at an institution and we're working on a project together, who owns our data?
Mm-hmm.
Is it, if I'm the lead person, do I own it, or does the other person own it because she has a policy at her institution that says her institution owns the data? So I think these are all things that have to be worked out. I think a lot of times that we just go ahead and say, whatever, we're just going to do our research, but it can really help at the beginning of a project to say who's going to have basically control of this data so things don't come up later. One interesting thing I will say is we're probably going to see some of these issues come to the fore more as we go along. One of the examples that I like to point to recently is from University of California, San Diego, and UCSD. UCSD and USC, where one researcher moved between institutions and said, we're going to take the data, and the institution said, no, we actually own the data, you can't have it. And there was this big lawsuit. So I think we're going to start seeing more enforcement of these kind of ownership issues and these disagreements based upon this kind of patchwork policy landscape that we might not have had to deal with before.
So I have two more. Oh, sorry. You were going to say something, Cheryl?
Well, it's just, I was thinking of some experiences that I've had in terms of the data archive and data center community where sometimes we're not, because of Congress, we're not allowed to share data with certain countries. Like Cuba is still on the list that we're not allowed to share like geoscience information with them. And I think it'll be interesting to see how some of these things play out in the legal system, like Kristin's example about the researcher at California. And I just was going to add that.
So just running down the last list of comments here, we have one that said, Kristin, somebody really liked your push not pull approach to getting buy-in. And then there was a last comment saying it seems like there's a need for an agile or rapid documentation and dissemination process in terms of kind of analyzing and disseminating and describing these data sets. And this person observes we may be able to identify best practices, but the landscape is constantly shifting.
Yeah, the landscape is shifting, and my big thing is nudging people. Like, you don't have to make the jump all the way to metadata. Maybe you need a lab notebook plus readme.txt files or a data dictionary. So it's going to be a slow process as we shift and develop and establish standards.
All right, well, thank you for your wonderful presentations, Michael, Cheryl, and Kristin. They were great. I really appreciate you taking the time to present today. This has been a very needed webinar, I feel like. If anybody has questions about the webinar or would like to review it later, I believe that ALISE will be providing it on the website for you to watch afterwards. It has been recorded, so the slides and everything should be available there if you want to review the material later on. Of course, you can contact, I'm assuming, each of the presenters individually if you have specific follow-up questions for them. I guess with that being said, does anybody else have anything else to add? Otherwise, we're done. It's been a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, just thank you, AJ, for organizing it.
Yeah, thank you, AJ, and the ALISE office for organizing this.
All right. Well, with that said, thank you all very much, and have a great rest of your day.